one of the rare actors who has been able to conquer all three fields of theater, film, and television, John Lithgow has built a career spanning more than 5 decades, with achievements that very few artists have attained. He is the recipient of many prestigious awards, including 6 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Television Performances, 2 Tony Awards for Outstanding Contributions on Broadway stages, along with 1 Golden Globe and 2 Oscar nominations for supporting roles in films such as The World According to Garp and Terms of Endearment. Not stopping there, he has also left a deep impression on mainstream audiences through his haunting role in Dexter and his excellent transformation into Winston Churchill in The Crown, a role that brought him another Emmy and global recognition. Besides that, he is also a best-selling children's book author, a voice artist, and a symbol of perseverance in the arts. Someone who can flexibly switch between comedy, drama, and complex psychological roles while still maintaining depth and authenticity. A career that is not only long but also diverse, not only successful, but also enduring over time. However, behind those achievements is not an easy or complete journey, but a long series of silences, losses, and unanswered questions. He grew up with the feeling of not belonging anywhere as his family constantly moved. He entered an industry that always favored loud stars rather than quiet people like him, went through a broken marriage that left cracks not easily mended, and throughout his career, he faced a persistent paradox of always being respected but rarely celebrated, always recognized for his talent but never becoming a mainstream icon. The roles ended, the applause died down, and he continued to move forward, not because he was sure he would win, but because he did not know how to stop. It was that persistence, that silence, and the will to continue existing in a constantly changing world that shaped the real him. A person who does not need to shine brightly to prove his worth, but only needs to stay, to work, and not to disappear. If the story of a person who is always present but never truly seen touches you, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a way to acknowledge those quiet people who never leave the game. Not everyone born into an artistic family grows up in the spotlight. And with John Lithgow, his childhood was not marked by rounds of applause, but by endless journeys, hasty packings, temporary rooms, and the feeling of always having to leave before staying long enough to call any place home. His father, a theater man, always took the whole family moving from one city to another, from small theaters to bigger stages, but for a child, each change was not an opportunity, but a loss. Losing faces he had just gotten used to, losing connections that had not yet formed, and most importantly, losing the sense of belonging, because every time he began to understand the rhythm of a place, it was also the time he had to leave it, only to step into a completely unfamiliar environment where everything already had its place except for him, the one who always came late, always had to observe before he could speak, and often never spoke at all, because he knew he would leave again. So what was the point of attaching when everything would end before it even began? In school, that became even more evident. The friend groups that had already existed, the relationships built over many years, and he, a newcomer, someone with no shared history, no shared memories, no clear place. He learned to stand outside, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. He observed how others talked, how they laughed, how they belonged to something he could not touch. And gradually he stopped trying to fit in, because each attempt only made him realize that he did not really belong there, and that feeling, repeated over the years, became a part of who he was. A silence not because he lacked things to say, but because he was not sure anyone was listening. But there was one place he always returned to, a place that did not require him to explain who he was, did not care where he came from, and did not ask how long he would stay. That was backstage at the theaters where his father worked, where he could stand quietly in the shadows, looking out at the light ahead, where other people stepped onto the stage, became someone else, were noticed, were listened to, were applauded. And in those moments, he was no longer the lost child, but an observer, a witness, someone who understood that there was a way to exist without needing to belong, just by being good enough to become anyone the story needed. He did not step onto the stage then. He was not called by name, but he saw what would later shape his entire life, that the light was not for everyone, but those standing in the shadows could still be the ones who kept the story going. Those evenings, when the audience left and the theater fell silent again, he was still there among the empty seats and the abandoned props. And perhaps it was in those silences that something began to form, not ambition, not a dream of becoming a star, but a very early acceptance that his life might always be like that, always in between, always moving, always observing, and always having to find his own way to exist in a world he had never truly felt he belonged to, and that did not break him, but it also never disappeared. It was there, quietly, persistently, like a small crack stretching through the years, reminding him that before he learned how to act, before he learned how to make others believe in the characters he created, he had to learn something much harder, which was how to exist when there was nowhere that was truly his. From those years of constantly leaving before he could stay, John Lithgow entered a new phase of life with a belief that had sunk in so deeply it was almost impossible to change. That if he was not good enough, not excellent enough, then he would disappear completely from the world's sight. And when the gates of Harvard opened, it was not only an opportunity, but also a harsh test for that very belief, because that place was unlike any environment he had ever known. It was no longer classrooms where he could quietly stand outside and observe, but a space where everyone was smart, everyone was ambitious, everyone was nurtured to become the best. And in a place like that, just being okay was not enough. Just existing was not enough, and for someone already used to the feeling of being forgotten, that became an invisible but heavy pressure, forcing him to push himself to the limit, not to surpass others, but to ensure that he would not disappear. Those days at Harvard were not a series of days filled with confidence, but mornings that began with anxiety and ended with self-questioning. He learned to control every small detail, from the way he spoke, the way he presented himself, to the way he appeared in front of others, because he believed that just one small mistake would be enough to return him to his familiar position, the position of someone no one remembered. And that very belief made him not allow himself to fail, not allow himself to be loose, not allow himself to become ordinary. He was not seeking to stand out. He was seeking perfection as a way to exist in an environment where everything was measured, compared, and evaluated. But Harvard, though harsh, was still a place where he could understand its rules, while Cambridge, the place he set foot in afterward, brought a different kind of loneliness, deeper and quieter, where he was not only a student among other students, but also an American in a strange world with cultural norms, ways of thinking, and connections that he could not easily blend into. There, he once again became an outsider, not because he was less than others, but because he did not belong. And that feeling, the feeling that had followed him since childhood, now returned more strongly, like a reminder that no matter how far he went or how well he studied, finding a place that truly belonged to him still felt distant. It was during those years that a habit was formed, not loud, not obvious, but persistent and dangerous. The habit of controlling himself to the point where there was almost no room for mistakes. He began to live by a standard he himself set. A standard with no room for weakness, no room for imperfect days, and no room for stopping to ask himself what he really wanted. Because for him, that question was not as important as continuing to move forward, continuing to do well, continuing to prove that he deserved to be seen. But the price of that control was a simmering tension, a feeling of always having to keep himself within boundaries, always having to ensure that nothing went beyond control. He learned to hide his doubts, learned to keep his exterior stable even when inside he was not certain at all. And gradually, not allowing himself to make mistakes became a part of who he was, no longer a choice but an instinct, a reflex built from the fear that if he loosened up even a little, everything he had built would disappear. Just like the places he had once left, just like the relationships he had not had time to hold on to. And it was precisely in that tension, in that almost absolute discipline, that he began to realize something he had perhaps felt for a very long time but had never named, that trying to become perfect did not make him feel like he belonged. It only made him become invisible in a different way. Because when you spend your whole life becoming what others expect, you gradually lose the sense of yourself. And in those rare moments when he stood alone with no one to witness and no one to judge, he could clearly feel that emptiness, not failure, but absence, the absence of a version of himself not defined by expectations, not controlled by the fear of being forgotten. But he did not stop. He did not allow himself to stop, because for him, stopping meant facing questions he was not ready to answer, and so he continued to study, continued to perfect himself, continued to build a person the world could accept, even when he was not sure he could accept that person himself. And perhaps throughout those years, the most important thing he learned was not knowledge, not skills, but a simple yet harsh principle that in a world where attention is rare, you only have two choices: either become so excellent that you cannot be overlooked, or quietly disappear as if you had never existed. And then, when those harsh years of study gradually came to a close, John Lithgow stepped into the place he once believed would be the answer to everything he lacked. The stage, where he no longer had to try to become a perfect version of himself, but could become anyone, where the light did not ask where he came from, or care how lost he had once been, as long as he stepped out and lived fully in the character. And in those early years on Broadway stages, he worked with an intensity few could sustain, day after day, role after role, with no pauses long enough to think and no gaps to feel, because he understood that if he stopped, all the doubts that had haunted him would return. So he chose to continue stepping onto the stage, to continue practicing, to continue perfecting, as if every role was an opportunity to prove that he deserved to be there, deserved to be seen, deserved not to be forgotten. Recognition came gradually, not loudly, not explosively, but enough for people to start noticing him. Praise from critics, prestigious theater awards, including victories at the Tony Awards, step by step, affirming that he was not just a hard-working actor, but a real talent, someone who could bring depth to any character he touched. And in the moments when he received those awards, perhaps for the first time in his life, he felt seen, not as an outsider, not as a name easily forgotten, but as someone with value, someone with a place in the world he had spent so many years trying to step into. But the light on stage only lasted for a moment. And when the curtain closed, when the rounds of applause gradually died down, reality returned. An empty room, a quiet hallway, a person who was no longer the character he had just embodied, but only himself. And in those moments, he began to realize something he had never prepared to face, that even though the stage could accept him, it did not keep him. It did not bring him the sense of belonging he had been searching for since he was a child, because every role had an ending, every story had a final act. And when the lights went out, all that remained was silence, a silence unlike anything else, because it was not rest, but a void that no character could fill. His life gradually became so tied to the roles he played that the boundary between work and self became blurred. He spent most of his time researching, practicing, becoming someone else, and when he did that well, when he completely disappeared into the character, people called it brilliant acting. But for him, it was also a way to escape the question of who he really was when there was no script, when there was no role, when there was no story to hold on to. And the more successful he became, the harder that question was to answer, because the world began to see him through the characters he portrayed. While he himself found it increasingly difficult to recognize himself in the mirror, there were nights, after everyone had left, when he still stayed, not because of work, but because he was not ready to leave the only place that made him feel meaningful. He walked through the empty rows of seats, touched the remaining props, listened to the silence of a space that had just been filled with emotion. And it was in those moments that he felt most clearly the truth he had tried to avoid, that the stage could give him everything except one thing he had always been searching for, the sense of belonging, because the stage was not home, it was only a place he came to, worked, and left, just like all the other places in his life. And so, even though he was applauded, even though he was recognized, even though he was called one of the most talented actors of his generation, a part of him still did not change, still remained the child who once stood outside, once observed others shining, once wondered if there was any place truly meant for him. And perhaps what made his journey so heavy was not that he was not successful, but that he had achieved so much, yet still could not find the feeling he had been searching for from the beginning, a feeling that could not be measured by awards, could not be replaced by rounds of applause, a simple but distant feeling that he was not only accepted in a role, but kept as his true self, even when the lights had gone out and no one was watching anymore. After the years spent between the lights of Broadway stages, John Lithgow began to step into the world of film with roles that both critics and audiences had to acknowledge. But that success never came as completely as he had imagined. Films like The World, according to Garp in terms of endearment, opened doors for him to Hollywood, bringing prestigious Oscar nominations, but at the same time made him realize that recognition, no matter how noble, was still not the same as becoming the center of the world he had just entered. He appeared, contributed, even created unforgettable moments on screen, but rarely was his name mentioned first. He still stood behind other stars, still served as support for the story, and that created a feeling both sweet and bitter, because he knew his talent was seen, but his position in the system was always on the sidelines. In each role, John Lithgow poured all his mind and energy, turning every gesture, every glance, every line into subtle details that brought the character to life. But then he wondered whether that excellence was enough to prove his own worth. Success, nominations, awards, all of them knocked on the door of recognition, but at the same time deepened in him the feeling of being compared, overshadowed, left behind others. He played supporting roles, but with a depth that sometimes even the lead role found hard to achieve. And that very difference made him question himself even more. Where did his real value lie when people remembered the role but might not remember the person who created it? That feeling of being lost followed him into the following years, when every role, whether small or large, had to be carefully considered, not only to serve the story, but also to maintain his position in an industry that always craved prominence and visibility. Every shoot, every scene, he carried the fear that if he was not perfect, if he did not stand out even in a supporting role, then everything he had built would disappear into the sea of other faces. The success he achieved felt like a faint reward, enough for others to applaud, but not enough to satisfy himself, because he still had to face the inner voices, the doubts about his value, about his reason for existing, about whether all his efforts were truly recognized or only hidden in the shadows of other characters. When standing in front of the camera, Lithgow understood that each role was an opportunity to prove himself, but also a challenge to keep himself from being swept away amid the bright lights of Hollywood. Scenes that audiences considered wonderful, praises from directors and colleagues, all created a layer that seemed to envelop his success, but in reality reminded him that he had never been the center, had never been the brightest star. Every round of applause rang out for the role, for the story, but the part of him standing behind it remained quiet and still, like a figure recognized but never shining in the way he himself craved. And it was precisely that contradiction between recognized excellence and the feeling of standing outside the center that formed part of his personality. A person who always poured all his mind and energy into every detail, but at the same time knew how to live in the shadows, learned to exist without needing the spotlight shining directly on him, learned to cherish every small moment of recognition, and realized that his real value did not lie in awards or public attention, but in the ability to bring life to characters, to bring depth to stories, and to maintain the perseverance of a quiet but enduring person who was always present, always contributing, even though he had never been the center of the lights. The life of John Lithgow, though always shining on stage and screen, went through private upheavals that few could imagine, especially in his first marriage. He entered this relationship with the expectation of a stable home, a place where he could feel he belonged. After years of childhood constantly moving and a feeling of being lost that had never left, at first, everything seemed full of promise, like a guiding light in a life full of changes. But the increasing pressure from his career quickly pulled the distance between him and his partner farther apart. Long rehearsals, consecutive roles, touring trips, and endless filming nights made shared time scarce and fragile. Silence gradually replaced conversations, shared moments, warm embraces, and although both tried to keep the relationship alive, that distance kept growing, quietly creating cracks that no single action or word could immediately mend. That relationship ended quietly, without any explosive event, without prolonged arguments or media shocks. It ended with the realization that the two had gone down different paths, that his career and professional responsibilities had taken up too much, and even though feelings still existed, they were not strong enough to hold on to the precious things in the family. That feeling of loss was not only the pain of a broken relationship, but also the realization that a part of him, the part that wanted to build a home, the part that craved belonging, had failed, and this left a simmering void that no solution could fill. It was like a door closing before he could say goodbye, a chapter in life closing in silence, but the pain remained intact, persisting with him in every step on stage, every scene on screen, every role into which he poured all his mind. The years after the first marriage, John Lithgow continued to build his career with all his ability, but every success came with loneliness. Every round of applause rang out for the roles, for the stories, but could not fill the void in his personal life. He realized that even though he could bring a character to life, even though he could conquer audiences, the loss in real life could not be compensated. But it was these experiences, the prolonged loneliness and sense of loss, that formed the depth in his acting, making him understand more clearly every movement, every gesture, every pain of the characters he portrayed. In the moments standing alone after a performance, he realized that life did not always allow us to keep everything important, and learning to endure, learning to disappear into the light and quietly exist in the shadows, was part of the art of living that he had had to grasp from very early on. Even after the difficult years of his first marriage and the prolonged loneliness, John Lithgow stepped into the world of Hollywood with all his ability and passion. But he soon realized that he did not belong to the molds that the entertainment industry usually built, where stars were shaped to become box office icons, familiar faces on posters, names that made audiences cheer just by appearing. Lithgow did not fit those standards. His height, appearance, demeanor, or even his comedic charm did not match the commercial star template that Hollywood desired. This made him struggle with a harsh reality, even though his talent was recognized, even though he appeared in important roles. He still had no clear position in the industry, was not defined as a market leader, and was frequently placed on the sidelines among other excellent colleagues whom the general public knew more about. However, that very thing created a special aspect in who he was. In the eyes of his peers, Lithgow was an actor they did not hesitate to respect. They knew his ability was not only in skill, but also in emotional depth, unlimited transformation, and the quiet perseverance that few could maintain. His career therefore continued to develop. But unlike movie stars who were chosen, Lithgow always existed like a silent pillar, there, important and solid, but not occupying the center of the light. Each role, each project he joined, carried its own mark. But it was never the lead role for everyone to remember the name. And this was the persistent paradox. He was admired and respected in the art world, but rarely recognized widely by the public. This led to a special journey of existence, a professional life without a center, where Lithgow had to learn to live in the light but never shine in the way commercial stars usually did. He learned to accept that supporting roles, characters outside the center of the story, could also bring profound influence, that the laughter, tears, fear, and pain he conveyed to the characters still had value, even when outside audiences did not remember his name. This was a harsh but important lesson. Fame or being the center did not always define value. They were people who existed, worked, and created influence without needing the spotlight shining on them. And Lithgow was one of those people. That existence, though not glamorous, still demanded extraordinary discipline and perseverance. He had to constantly perfect his skills, always prepare for the next role, always maintain inner strength in the face of the lack of public recognition. Each day that passed, he stepped into the set, onto the stage, into new scenes where no one called his name except the directors and colleagues. But he still gave his all, still poured his entire ability and emotion so that the character lived, so that the story became convincing, so that the audience felt it, even when they did not know who stood behind. This was a kind of quiet perseverance, a kind of endurance that few outside the industry understood, a journey where all glory was turned into personal experience, where Lithgow existed as someone who kept the rhythm for the entire work without ever needing to be the center. And it was thanks to that steadfastness that he gradually affirmed his position, not in the public eye, but in the hearts of those who understood art. Each award, each praise from colleagues, each highly regarded role became proof of a life lived fully and meaningfully, even if it was not a life brightly illuminated. Lithgow learned to accept that a career did not need to fill box offices or magazine covers to bring value. Honesty, dedication, and the ability to exist in a world not meant for him were what created real glory. And in the following years, he continued to move forward, quietly but firmly, in an industry he never fully belonged to, turning difference into strength, turning, not standing at the center, into a meaningful way of life that honored himself. After the years living in the light but never being the center, John Lithgow found a temporary home in the world of television, with the show Third Rock from the Sun, where he was loved by audiences and became a familiar face in the living rooms of millions of families. Success in the role of Dick Solomon, the alien pretending to be human, brought him humor, absurd but intelligent situations, and made audiences laugh through every episode. For the first time, laughter rang out because of him, because of his ability to turn unrealistic situations into joy, making people forget their daily fatigue. And Lithgow realized that even if audiences might not know his name, the humorous image of the character had brought him closer to the public, a new feeling after many years standing on the sidelines of stage and film. But along with that joy was a persistent paradox. Although he was known and loved, Lithgow was tied to the role of a comedic actor, a label he never sought and did not fully match with the deep, dramatic foundation he had trained for many years on Broadway. Recognition from audiences meant they only saw the fun surface, the laughs, the humorous lines, while forgetting the depth, subtlety, and transformative ability that Lithgow brought to each role. This created a simmering contradiction. He was applauded and loved, but at the same time felt misunderstood, as if all his efforts and real talent only existed inside, where no one saw. The laughter ringing on screen, in living rooms, on television channels, could not fill the void in his soul, the void that had long been formed from a childhood of constant moving. isolation at Harvard and Cambridge, and the years on the sidelines of Broadway stages during the filming of Third Rock from the Sun, Lithgow learned to balance the need for public entertainment with the artistic demands of his own. Each time he stepped into a scene, he had to transform from a real person with all his worries, pressures, and absences into Dick Solomon, the humorous, optimistic, sometimes naive, but always lovable character. This process required intense focus, not only on expressive technique, but also on controlling rhythm, timing, and interaction with colleagues, even though the audience's eyes only recorded the humor. Lithgow knew that inside it was an effort to maintain spiritual vitality, to prove that he still deserved to exist, even when people only saw small laughs instead of the entire inner depth. Fame with a comedic role brought Lithgow a strange relationship with the public. They loved him, but did not fully understand him. They laughed with him, but did not see the loneliness, the perseverance, and the mental scars he carried in every step on stage and every scene on screen. Each laugh, each humorous moment was a layer to cover the quiet pain. And Lithgow learned to live with this paradox, enjoying the joy the role brought while knowing it could not heal the voids inside. This experience helped him develop a special sensitivity, the ability to observe people in deep emotions, the ability to bring into every gesture, glance, and line layers of emotion that audiences did not see but felt. Lithgow became a two-faced actor. On screen, he brought laughter, light, and entertainment. Behind the scenes, he was a person always struggling with loneliness, with never feeling enough, but still continuing to stand firm, still continuing to contribute and bring characters to life. In the rare moments after filming, when the lights went out and the laughter had died down, Lithgow returned to the familiar silence where he could face himself. He clearly felt that laughter, no matter how loud, could not fill the void that his entire life had built from childhood, from the years of study and broken relationships. And it was in this contrast between the laughter outside and the void inside that Lithgow realized the nature of who he was. A person who lived persistently and quietly, always present in every moment of art, regardless of external recognition. And it was that, the quiet perseverance between laughter and loneliness, that shaped an important part of the legacy he left. A legacy not only of laughter but also of perseverance, depth, and character. After the years bringing laughter and entertainment, John Lithgow stepped into a new and challenging chapter in his career when he took on the role of Arthur Mitchell, the serial killer with two parallel lives, a typical father and a brutal murderer, which brought him strong recognition from both critics and television audiences. This role was not simply an opportunity to shine, but also a psychological test that Lithgow had never experienced before. Because to bring a serial killer to life, he had to delve into the dark corners of humanity, explore thoughts that normally no one wanted to see, and from there, he himself was pulled along and affected by the shadows he entered into the character. Arthur Mitchell is a complex character with two sides existing in parallel: an ordinary man, a devoted father, and a brutal, calculating killer. This contrast demanded that Lithgow simultaneously understand, feel, and express both worlds in one body, in one glance, in every movement, every line of dialogue. The process of immersing himself in the role extended not only during filming hours, but also seeped into his personal life, forcing him to struggle with undefined emotions, persistent obsessions from the character, and gradually the boundary between the character and himself became blurred. He realized that in some way, the feeling of living two lives that Arthur Mitchell brought also reflected his own experience. A person standing between two worlds, between expectations and reality, between light and darkness, between his true self and the image others saw. Lithgow often shared that immersing himself in the role of Arthur Mitchell made him feel difficult to separate from what he had portrayed, because to create a complete character, he had to internalize the emotions, thoughts, and pain the character went through. This led to long nights when he returned home still hearing the echoes of the character in his mind, the inner conflicts he had just lived with on screen. This psychological influence was unlike previous roles, where laughter or humor created a natural distance. This was a persistent darkness that clung to him, reminding him that deep immersion was not only art, but also part of life experience. During the filming days, Lithgow realized the astonishing similarity between the character and himself, that the feeling of standing outside the center, being misunderstood, and sometimes having to express more than what he could share also existed in his life from when he was a child. From the time at Harvard, Cambridge, Broadway stages, to the supporting roles in film and television. This experience made him empathize with the character more than anyone else, and also made him appreciate the subtlety in every role, every moment he created, because he knew that understanding the darkness inside people was not something easily achieved. The scenes where Lithgow had to portray brutality but still balance it with a calm exterior caused him many times to remind himself not to get drawn into the character too deeply to the point of losing control. But it was precisely that pull, the direct confrontation with darkness, that became his strength, helping the character become so vividly haunting, helping audiences see not just a murderer, but a person with depth, a dark truth that few dared to look straight at. And even after the scenes ended, Lithgow still carried that heavy feeling in his mind, realizing that the ability to internalize a character too deeply would make him feel empty and lonely. But it was also an opportunity to understand himself better, to comprehend inner conflicts, and to learn how to live with darkness without being crushed. This process elevated him from a comedic actor or memorable supporting player to a new level where people not only appreciated his acting ability, but also admired his endurance, his empathy, and the psychological depth he brought to every character. Lithgow learned to accept that darkness, learned to turn it into strength, and learned to move forward even while always feeling a part of himself was occupied by what he had lived with the character. This experience marked a turning point in his career, where recognition came hand in hand with loneliness, where success brought both light and darkness, and where he proved that a true actor was not just someone who created laughter or fear, but someone who dared to confront himself and the deepest dark corners. After the profound experiences with the darkness of the character Arthur Mitchell, John Lithgow stepped into another challenge, but this time it was a comprehensive test where his career, reputation, and spirit were all put on the scale when he took on the role of Winston Churchill in the series The Crown. This was one of the greatest historical icons of Britain, an image etched in the public mind through books, documentaries, and legends of World War II. And the appearance of an American actor to embody Churchill immediately forced Lithgow to face enormous pressure from public opinion, from professionals to demanding audiences who doubted whether a non-British actor could recreate the weight, presence, and authority of the character the whole world knew. The first days of preparing for the role were a challenge both physically and mentally. Lithgow had to thoroughly research the distinctive voice, every tone, every breath, every rising and falling nuance in Churchill's speeches, while also learning how to move, how to stand, how to hold the microphone, how to look and interact with surrounding characters so that every detail reflected the true spirit of the historical leader. It was not only technique, but also an intense inner process, because every misplaced movement, every off-rhythm tone could be criticized by the public and damage his reputation at the late stage of his career when Lithgow was no longer a young man just stepping into Hollywood, but a veteran actor with all expectations placed on his shoulders. The constant fear of failure surrounded him, not only because this role was the peak of acting challenge, but also because every role at this point was tied to his personal image and the legacy he had built over many decades. Lithgow had to learn to balance external pressure with the strict standards he set for himself, had to face long, sleepless nights analyzing every scene, practicing every tone, every glance, every breath to ensure that the image of Churchill through him was both truthful, convincing, and respectful of history. This was a process that demanded patience, endurance, and the ability to withstand tremendous mental pressure that few roles could compare to. Throughout the filming process, Lithgow realized that the pressure came not only from outside but also from within himself, from the overly high expectations, from the worry that all efforts might not be enough to convince, from the feeling of having to live up to his name, experience, and achievements. Each successful scene still could not dispel the restlessness, because he knew that recognition from audiences or awards could not completely erase the mental pressure, that this role was not just a character but a symbol, and he had to bring his entire self, entire experience, and focus to embody it fully. Nevertheless, Lithgow still overcame every obstacle. The hours of practice, research, and rigorous immersion finally brought brilliant success. His portrayal of Winston Churchill was highly praised by both critics and the public, bringing him a prestigious Emmy Award. Affirming his superior talent and versatility in acting, once again proving that he could transform into any character, from humorous to dark, from supporting roles to complex historical icons. But even when success was achieved, the pressure did not disappear. Lithgow still had to continue maintaining absolute precision in every scene, had to keep his focus and patience so that no small detail betrayed the character or history. That pressure became part of his daily life, reminding him that becoming an excellent actor was not just achieving success, but enduring and continuing. Always continuing, even when facing enormous fears and responsibilities. For Lithgow, the role of Churchill was not only a professional challenge, but also a lesson in perseverance, in enduring pressure, and in how to live with the invisible expectations placed on his shoulders. He learned to balance emotions, technique, and responsibility between expectations from outside and demands from himself. And this very thing created depth not only in the role, but also in himself as a person. An artist who never stopped striving, a man who had gone through every trial in life, and a soul that continued to stand firm despite all doubts, pressures, and fears, proving that perseverance and patience were truly the foundation of a long career and an indelible legacy. Even after conquering the great challenge with the role of Winston Churchill, John Lithgow still did not find a true stopping point in his professional journey, because his life seemed to always be shaped by continuous transformation and the remarkable ability to adapt to every type of role. From the humorous characters in Third Rock from the Sun to the dark villain roles like Arthur Mitchell, then the heavy historical icons like Churchill, Lithgow never allowed himself to be limited to a fixed image. Each character he immersed himself in was not just a new role, but also another version of himself, a way to challenge himself, to explore the depth of emotions and acting ability. But at the same time, it also made him feel tired and sometimes lost, because when switching between characters, the boundary between his true self and the image on screen became blurred, making it hard for him to recognize himself. The feeling of always being on a journey but without a destination became a familiar part of his life. Lithgow was no longer the lost boy at Cambridge or Harvard, no longer the child standing outside Broadway stages, but those experiences still left a deep mark. He always felt the absence, the feeling that no matter how many successes, how many excellent roles, it was still not enough to define his real position in this vast world. His career developed strongly. Fame and awards gradually appeared, but Lithgow still realized that fulfillment was not a state that could be reached. It was a continuous journey where each success opened up new challenges, where every award and praise came with doubt about his own value, whether he was truly seen and understood correctly, or just an image on screen that audiences casually assigned to the character. The continuous transformation through roles also forced Lithgow to face the persistent question about personal identity outside the roles. Who was John Lithgow when the stage lights went out, when the camera stopped, when the rounds of applause and praises died down? He had spent his whole life becoming the characters others wanted, living in the stories that writers, directors, and audiences created. But this non-stop dedication sometimes made him feel scattered, without a separate image to identify. Each role was a door opening to new experiences and emotions, but at the same time it was also a reminder that the real John Lithgow, the one standing outside the lights and not defined by any character, was still on the path of searching for himself. However, instead of making him collapse, this transformation became the driving force for non-stop development. Lithgow learned to use each role to deepen his skills, to understand people better, to explore emotional and psychological depths that few actors could reach. It was, thanks to this ability to adapt and transform, that he could exist in a harsh industry where fame was often reserved for those clearly labeled, while he, through patience, perseverance, and the ability to quietly transform, had built a long-lasting career, rich in depth and full of influence, even though he was never the center of the spotlight. In the rare moments when he stood in front of the mirror after a performance, Lithgow saw the image of himself, a person who had lived through many characters, many different lives, but had never felt completely whole. He realized that his career was not about reaching a final destination, but a series of continuous journeys where each character, each role, each award, and each moment of recognition contributed to shaping who he was. A resilient, profound person who was always learning, always adapting, and always existing between the light and darkness of the industry he had chosen. Lithgow understood that it was precisely the continuous ability to transform and the perseverance in enduring loneliness and pressure that shaped his legacy. Not fame or prominence, but a life lived fully, honestly, and patiently walking on the journey of finding himself, even though that path never had a final destination. After many years struggling with loneliness and the continuous challenges of his career, John Lithgow found a peaceful harbor in his second marriage, a relationship that brought him the stability that had seemed non-existent before. His second wife, Mary Yeager, became a solid anchor not only for him, but also for the whole family, bringing moments where he could temporarily set aside the stage lights, set aside the complex roles and the non-stop pressures of Hollywood. Beside Mary, Lithgow found peace in simple things, preparing dinner together, reading to the children, taking walks on quiet afternoons, or simply talking without camera lights or audience laughter, moments he once thought he would no longer have the chance to experience after many decades chasing fame and roles. This new life was not glamorous, not loud, not tied to awards or public recognition, but those silent moments, those ordinary days brought Lithgow a value greater than any stage light. He learned to cherish the small things, the details that seemed ordinary but were the pillars for his spirit and happiness, from the hug of his child, his wife's smile, to the afternoons together enjoying a good book or a quiet meal. These moments taught him that peace was not something distant or only for famous people. It was created and maintained by his own effort and attention to simple but meaningful things. For Lithgow, family became a place where he no longer had to transform, no longer had to prove or hide anything. A place where he could be completely himself. His career, with all its successes, great roles, and prestigious awards, still continued to demand his dedication. But now he knew how to keep a distance so as not to be swept away, to balance between work and personal life. He spent time watching his children grow up, guiding and teaching them, while still maintaining his work schedule, practicing and preparing for the next roles. Those peaceful moments, though small, became precious because Lithgow understood that his life had once passed through too many years in bright but cold lights, in roles where he was only part of the story rather than the one leading it. Now, slowing down, feeling family life and ordinary things became a joy and a source of inner strength, helping him maintain clarity, balance, and the ability to continue facing the professional challenges ahead. Each day, Lithgow learned to hold on to these values, things that could not be bought with money or awards, moments that could not be replaced by lights or rounds of applause. He cherished doing homework with his children, sharing old stories, laughing at silly and simple things. Feeling his wife's presence beside him, and in all of it, he found the peace of mind that his youth and the busy years with Broadway or Hollywood had never brought. The stability in his personal life, the peace in the family, and the ability to maintain these simple but meaningful moments became an indispensable part of who John Lithgow was, helping him stand firm in an ever-changing industry where pressure, competition, and misunderstanding always lurked. Now, he was not only a veteran actor with a series of successes in hand, but also a father, a husband, a person who knew how to cherish simple things. And thanks to that, he continued to walk on the journey of his life, still resilient, still enduring, and still keeping a quiet inner self amid the storms of Hollywood. As age began to leave marks on every wrinkle and in his eyes, John Lithgow began to clearly feel the change in his professional opportunities. Hollywood, with its non-stop pace of change, no longer favored familiar faces. Young actors full of passion and freshness appeared more and more, bringing new energy and models that the public could easily love more. Lithgow realized that despite everything he had achieved, prominence was not eternal, and the worry that his name might gradually fade became a quiet but persistent pressure. He was no longer at the center of attention, no longer the first name audiences thought of when mentioning acting, and that made every appearance on stage or on screen carry a part of the fear that his effort, perseverance, and talent might be forgotten. The days of filming, new scenes, or stage performances were no longer just challenges of technique or immersion. They became tests of mental endurance, of the ability to maintain his own identity in an industry that never stopped moving. Lithgow continued to work with all his focus and passion, even knowing he was no longer the center, that the rounds of applause no longer rang loudly just for him, and that many audiences, even colleagues, might remember the role but forget the actor behind it. But that anxiety did not make him step back. On the contrary, it pushed him to contribute more, to cherish every performance moment and each opportunity to create a vivid, subtle, and memorable role. For Lithgow, the fear of being forgotten was not a public failure, but a simmering feeling in his heart, reminding him of the finiteness of time and age. He had once experienced the feeling of loneliness when having to stand outside friend groups in childhood, had once learned to exist when being misunderstood or standing outside the center in many previous roles. Now, this worry returned in a different form, more subtle and quiet, reminding him that a career, no matter how enduring and impressive, still had to face the rules of time. However, Lithgow did not let that fear control him. He learned to accept that continuing to stand on stage or appear on screen did not necessarily have to come with prominence or brilliant recognition, but more importantly, the ability to bring depth, emotion, and truth to each character. He continued to choose roles, continued to practice, continued to seek opportunities to express himself, even when the bright lead roles had become fewer, even when the spotlight seemed to favor younger faces. This choice did not come from the need to be noticed, but from a quiet determination to exist, to contribute, and to leave a mark through each character, whether the public remembered him or not. In the rare days off, Lithgow often spent time observing young actors, seeing them burst out and take over the lights, and felt the fear not to step back but to learn how to adjust himself, how to find his value not based on temporary attention. He realized that age was not an obstacle but an inevitable part of life, and that perseverance, the ability to adapt, and subtlety in acting were what helped him stand firm through generations, rising above the fleeting spotlight of young stars. That very fear of being forgotten also became the motivation for Lithgow to maintain his focus on details, to maintain his ability to transform and the depth in each role, to continue contributing to the art he loved, and to prove that the real value of an actor did not lie in how much or how little he was remembered, but in the ability to live fully with the profession, to create believable, memorable, and emotionally rich characters. While the public gradually changed, New generations of actors appeared, and the spotlight sometimes seemed to recede. Lithgow still continued to move forward, quietly but firmly, holding on to his own identity, existing through each decade, and showing that the fear of fading was not the end, but an opportunity to prove inner strength and the perseverance of a person who truly loved the craft. And from the years facing age, the fear of being forgotten, and the pressure from an industry that always sought new faces, John Lithgow realized a truth that few wanted to admit. Not all greatness was tied to brilliant fame or roles that filled box offices. People like him, even if they did not always stand at the top, even if they were not the name the public mentioned first, could still maintain a long-term presence, could still leave a deep mark through each role, each scene, and each work they touched. Lithgow understood that a career was not always explosive. Sometimes it was a slow, quiet, but enduring process, where each choice, each contribution accumulated to create real value. He saw clearly that becoming an excellent actor did not necessarily have to be tied to the spotlight or fame, but more importantly, the ability to persevere, the ability to exist and keep developing in an environment full of competition and non-stop change. Throughout his long career, Lithgow had learned to cherish the roles that many might consider supporting roles, because those very roles gave him the opportunity to hone his skills, to explore character depth, and to nurture creativity. Each character, whether small or large, was a challenge, and turning a supporting role into an unforgettable part of the story was proof of his talent and patience. He realized that big lights did not necessarily create big value. Sometimes perseverance, the spirit of quiet dedication, and the ability to maintain quality over many decades were what affirmed the person and the real legacy of an actor. Lithgow also understood that value did not lie in becoming the center or being praised by everyone, but in the way he existed, the way he worked, and the way he lived with his profession. His career was proof of a different way of existing in the entertainment industry, without needing to explode, without needing brilliant spotlight, but still able to influence and touch audiences' hearts, still create vivid and memorable characters, and still maintain credibility in the eyes of colleagues, directors, and those who truly understood art. This was the greatness that few saw, a quiet but enduring greatness. Like the way he had walked through a lonely childhood, the years of pressured study, the supporting roles in film, Broadway stages, and complex television scenes to become a respected actor without needing the spotlight to cover him. The years spent in this quiet light had taught Lithgow that sometimes greatness was not about someone shouting your name on billboards or magazine covers, but the ability to live fully with the craft, to dedicate and maintain honesty in every role, every scene, every professional decision. He proved that an actor could create profound difference without becoming a mainstream icon, that influence and value lay in perseverance, endurance, and the ability to exist long-term, not in temporary applause or fleeting attention. In an industry that honored those who appeared brilliantly then quickly disappeared, Lithgow found comfort in the ability to maintain continuous presence, in creating moments and characters that people remembered for a long time, and in the way he lived with the craft, holding firm to his identity and values through many decades. This was a lesson about patience, about cherishing the process more than the result, and about how a person could achieve greatness in their own way, quietly but surely, without needing to stand out, without needing to be celebrated, yet still leaving an indelible mark. Lithgow understood that the spotlight could fade, names could dim, but the real value of a life and a career was measured by perseverance, dedication, and the ability to live fully with the profession one had chosen, and that very philosophy had shaped both the man, the career, and his legacy. Looking back over more than 8 decades of John Lithgow's life, we see a long journey measured not only by awards, roles, or public spotlight, but also by perseverance, depth, and the ability to exist continuously through each phase. From the childhood days of constantly moving with his father, standing outside friend groups, observing everything from the sidelines without belonging anywhere, to the pressured study years at Harvard and Cambridge, where excellence was the only thing that could help him be recognized. Lithgow had learned to live with loneliness, learned to endure and adapt from very early on. Broadway stages, where he began stepping into the profession, brought rounds of applause and prestigious Tony Awards, but could not compensate for the feeling of absence, for having to constantly change roles, living in different characters without ever truly being seen as his real self. He stepped into Hollywood with supporting roles in films like The World According to Garp and Terms of Endearment, receiving Oscar nominations, but his position was never at the center, never the first name audiences thought of. His career developed, success and recognition appeared, but along with that came the feeling of standing behind others, the feeling of doubting his own value, the loneliness still present in every step, in every moment in front of the camera. These experiences, though painful, helped him understand deeply about characters, about people, about emotions that few could feel, and it was thanks to that each of his roles always carried an astonishing depth and subtlety. Even after the success with Third Rock from the Sun brought him closer to the public, it also led to misunderstanding when he was labeled as a comedic actor. While the depth and subtlety in dramatic art remained his main foundation, the role of Arthur Mitchell in Dexter, the role of Winston Churchill in The Crown, and many other roles continued to challenge him psychologically, forcing him to confront darkness, loneliness, pressure, and the fear of failure. But it was precisely these challenges that created the depth and richness in his acting ability. Although he had never stood at the top of the star system, Lithgow had never been the center of the spotlight or a face constantly appearing on magazine covers. But he still persisted in working, still remained present, still contributed and brought value. Every role, every scene, every step in his career was proof of perseverance, of the ability to adapt and live with the profession he had chosen. He found joy in simple moments, in family, in roles that allowed him to explore character depth, and in the way he stood firm through the years when the public spotlight did not shine directly on him. The personal losses, the voids in his private life, the relationships that had passed without being held, all were part of that journey. But Lithgow did not let them break him. Instead, he learned to integrate them into himself, learned to work with the loneliness and pressure, learned to turn those experiences into strength in his art. Every character, every role, was the result of a rich inner life, a deep understanding of people, and the ability to transform personal experiences into genuine emotions on screen. At the age of 80, John Lithgow still continued to be present, still worked, still contributed to the art he loved, but no longer chased the spotlight, no longer needed to prove anything to the public. His legacy did not lie in the number of awards or the level of fame, but in the ability to exist long-term, in perseverance, in acting depth, and in the ability to create vivid, memorable characters, regardless of his position in the system or the light shining directly on him. Lithgow was proof of a different way of existing in the entertainment industry, where greatness was not always tied to the center, where value was measured by perseverance, endurance, and the quality of each role, where a life did not disappear even when it was never the focus, and where he, with all his experiences, efforts, and dedication, had built a vibrant, weighty, and emotional legacy that those who loved art would never forget. The story of John Lithgow was vivid proof that greatness was not always tied to the spotlight or brilliant fame, and at the same time, it was a painful reminder of the loneliness, losses, and quiet pressures that even the most excellent people had to endure. From a childhood of constantly moving with his father's theater work, standing outside friend groups, never having a place to call home, to the stressful years at Harvard and Cambridge where academic pressure forced him to become perfect so as not to be forgotten, John Lithgow had gone through seemingly invisible but profound upheavals that shaped a resilient yet deeply wounded inner self. The years on Broadway stages with prestigious Tony Awards, brought recognition but could not fill the void in his soul. The supporting roles in film, the humorous characters on Third Rock from the Sun, or the role of Arthur Mitchell in Dexter and Winston Churchill in The Crown were all proof of his diversity, depth, and extraordinary endurance. But they were also psychological and emotional challenges that made him confront loneliness and pressure that few in the industry understood. Details such as standing quietly backstage observing others shine, the silence after performances, the loneliness of not being remembered by name by the public, or the perseverance in facing pressure when embodying historical characters, all showed a person who had never stopped striving and existing through every circumstance, even when he was not always recognized. The real lesson for the American people was that perseverance, patience, and the ability to exist quietly had value equal to, if not greater than, outstanding successes, and that, in a highly competitive world, maintaining one's identity, dedicating oneself to the craft, and cherishing the simple moments of family life or quiet joys were true greatness. Lithgow taught us that there was no need for the spotlight to become important. Continuing to move forward, continuing to contribute, and not giving up on oneself was the proof of a life worth cherishing. If the story of John Lithgow touched you, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so we can together honor those quiet but resilient people in art and in life. See you again in the next video, where we will continue to explore lives full of challenges, perseverance, and admiration that the spotlight sometimes cannot reach.